Recording. So I'd like to welcome everyone to Remixing High School English with Jim Pedrich. It's always wonderful to see people from all over Ontario joining us for the OTF Connect sessions. And we are really thankful that you're here with us for these professional development opportunities. I'm just going to turn it over to Jim, and he's going to lead you through 90 minutes of Remixing High School English. So over to you, Jim.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming in. You know, Molly and I talked a few times on the weekend, and I thought I had a busy schedule. Yours is crazy. There were times we contacted each other, and you're all over the place, and that's so. I just want to thank you for spending all that time making sure that this would start smoothly. Welcome. Thanks everyone for joining us. A little bit about myself before we get, fair enough, you're actually retired, I love it. A few things about me first. I'm the English and Canadian World Studies Department Head at Holy Cross Catholic Secondary School in Strathroy, Ontario. I'm very involved on Twitter and social media, so if you want to follow me and contact me there, I believe you'll find a link on the side there as well. I'm going to shamelessly plug a few projects I'm involved in too, if that's okay. The first is an amazing one called Project Kakuma, and it's spearheaded by a gentleman named Koen Timmers, who's in the top 10 finalists for the Global Teacher Prize this year. So basically what we do to this project is he arranges Skype lessons for students in refugee camps in Kenya, and the teachers are from all over the world. And so my role in that is to provide curricular connections. I've become more familiar with Kenyan curriculum than I ever thought I would, but it's been an amazing experience. So if you want to check that out, you certainly can, and there are ways to get involved in that project if you wish. The other one is my website, pedrect.ca. I play more video games than I probably should, and I love to try and make video games as well. And my latest project is a game designed to teach students about the community of Africville next to Halifax that was destroyed in the late 60s and early 70s. And so this game is a free game that students and teachers can play online via their browser to learn more about this community, and it's all aligned with the grade 10 curriculum. So if you happen to know any history teachers who might be interested, feel free to share that with them so they can try that out with their students as well. I will also be periodically referring to my blog during this presentation, and the link to it is just on the side there, pedrect.wordpress.com. And I use that mainly almost as a way of laying out my lessons for students. So if there's anything you ever want to use that you find on that blog, please feel free. I have been really excited about this for quite some time. But first, I always like to know what people are reading. So if you wouldn't mind, either via the chat or preferably on the screen using the text tool we introduced to a few moments ago, if you wouldn't mind just writing whatever you are reading at the moment, I'd just like to know what you're up to. So I'm going to add mine. The hate you give, interesting. Collaborative leadership from Ferrari. Excellent. Romeo and Juliet. Nice. The Marrow Thieves. Ooh, I've heard of that one. Ooh. The End of Protest. That sounds really interesting. Wow. So one of the reasons I want you to think about this briefly, besides the fact that it's just interesting, whatever the text that we are reading, short stories with my 9 applied students, of course, is that in the context of what we're going to look at today, everything we do is some kind of remix, whether it's the text we study or the very approach that I'm going to lay out for you today in terms of how we approach English in my 3 EU class this semester. So, Mally, I believe there's a link to a video for this slide. Would you mind throwing that up in the chat? There we are. Okay, so what I'd like you to do, if you wouldn't mind, this link will take you to the opening, or a video called Everything is Remix. And if you wouldn't mind just watching in your own browser the first minute 20 or so of this video. And when you come back, what I'd like all of us to discuss is how you see the text that we've laid out on this page in front of us as a remix. What may have been the inspirations for these texts, and what texts might these authors have been borrowing from. So I'll give you about 2 minutes to take a quick look at that video.
And if you want to put a green check mark in when you're finished and you're back with us, just so that we know. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I think Mike and Sarah are still, looks like they still might be finishing up that video. As we wait, so here's what I'd like you to think about. You have just watched a quick video that outlines the argument that everything is a remix, and that what we have to do first is we have to learn how to copy things effectively. And I'm going to make the argument that the approach we used in 3U this year, when we tried to remix our English class, couldn't have happened unless we had done it traditionally first. But I'd also like to know, given the list of texts you see on the screen and the ones you've added, where do you see elements of the remix in them, either by the authors that may have inspired these texts, or even texts that maybe have come after it? So the one that comes to mind, I added Sapiens, which is a great book examining the entire history of humanity. It reminds me very much of another text I read called The Intimate History of Humanity. And I find it almost impossible to believe that this text I'm reading now could have existed if that first one hadn't, right? So Joel has added, I found the idea that students need to understand the language of their domain. Very interesting. Joel, what do you mean by that? Joel, if you have a microphone, feel free to add that way. If you want to express your ideas on the side as well, that's great. Anyone else, either through the chat or through the whiteboard?
Yeah, what I meant by the language of their domain is kind of, I guess, the language in which they operate, the language of their craft, whether it's their own part-time job. There's a language they have that they use when they work at the restaurant. They have their own short form. But I thought it was interesting when I get students to write an essay that they think that they are writing a unique idea. And it's like they're trying to prove something that is new to them, not necessarily new to humanity because they're not working on a master's or a PhD thesis. And I think they struggle with that. They think that a thesis has to be unique to humanity as opposed to unique to them. It's the first time they're learning this idea, so they're remixing within a context of something that's already been discovered, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And so by going through that process, eventually that's where the potential for new ideas are possible, I think, right? Another way of expressing that is maybe students don't know what they don't know, right? Until they have been exposed to some of these ideas, it's hard for them to really break new ground. The other connection I think that Joel's making me think of is that we spent a lot of time this year talking about, we didn't use the phrasing language of their domain, but we try to encourage students to explore different domains that interested them, and so that required them to learn that language, which is really interesting. Seeing some great comments on the side. April, was that you who raised your hand, I think? Okay, so I do see a comment from the Marrow Thieves, although I've only just started the book. It's very similar to Indian Horse. So again, we're seeing similarities and references to Tupac, which is always good, and references to Hamlet as well. And I think, too, if you're an English teacher, you've ever taught anything from Shakespeare, you're very familiar with that idea of the remix. You might not have called it the remix, but certainly Shakespeare was borrowing heavily from previous writers, and certainly other writers have copied his style and the narratives themselves and played around with those in all sorts of interesting ways. So let's try and keep that idea with us as we proceed. The reason why this all came about is last year I asked our graduating 4U classes what they had enjoyed the least about English class in 4 years. And I was prepared for a wide variety of things, but what I wasn't prepared for was they all said the exact same thing. They all mentioned one course, ENG3U. And their explanations were almost all identical. They talked about the fact that the course gave them no choice. They didn't feel really connected to many of the texts. They somewhat like the novels we were studying, but for the most part, they didn't feel engaged by the options or the tasks we were having them do. And one of the major reasons for that was that the course had been kind of cobbled together year after year. Frankenstein's monster would also be an apt image here. My predecessor was a great department head, had kind of laid the groundwork for that, and instead of refreshing this course, we just kept adding little components, and it became this really unwieldy thing that wasn't really serving the students' interests. And so as soon as we learned that almost every student's least favorite course was this one, we knew we had to try something new. Luckily for me, the timing of that coincided with a few other major developments for me. Last year, I worked with four of the people who see on this list: Jamie, Adam, Matthew, and Sandra, on the new version of EMS 3.0 Media Studies Online. So we rewrote that course, but we didn't just simply rewrite it. We started from scratch. Right? All of us had worked in the course in some way or had some experience running online courses. And so we decided to revamp the course completely. So we threw out everything we had, and we came down to a really, what we felt like was a really useful and practical and meaningful way of approaching things. We divided everything into three main units: student as consumer, student as analyst, and student as producer. And so what that allowed us to do was to really get away from some of the assumptions we were making about that course in the past, and allow us to really focus on the sort of things that students were interested in, and to build from that. Another key factor in this undertaking was Rachel Collingshaw. I'm going to guess if you teach anywhere in the Ottawa area, you know who Rachel is. I don't know how many textbooks she has written in the social sciences and history, but it's a considerable amount. And I've worked with Rachel before, and her focus on what are called the historical thinking concepts and inquiry just frames everything she has her students do. And I remember working with her and thinking, you know, we haven't really articulated, at least at our school, anything like that for English. And we started wondering, are there a set of questions that we could use that would help students really get into the texts in a really different sort of way? And the first name at the top of the list, Melissa. Melissa's my colleague, and she has always been really, really open to improving learning experiences for students and giving them new ideas and giving them new ways to approach what we're doing. And so the two of us worked together to come up with an approach that we thought would work. Now I'm going to zoom in on different parts of this diagram in a second. I just want to stress to you that this is our original plan, and we ended up moving away from it in some ways. We were concerned by, so I see on the Joel on the side has made a great point. The difficulty lies in identifying specifically the end goal for studying English. I think that's an excellent point, and that's what we were struggling with. And we were kind of hoping that if we were able to articulate that for students, or at least ask the right sort of questions we thought that would get them to that end goal, that the purpose behind everything would become much clearer, and they would buy into the learning experience. So our original plan was in some ways a remix, but was really relying on some of the things that I think English teachers have traditionally done. This is a part we are really excited about, and Joel, this might connect to what you were just asking about. We tried to come up with a series of questions that we thought would really drive student learning. And this is what we came up with, the basic question of how does this thing work? So regardless of which text students were looking at, that they would be able to identify the nuts and bolts, the conventions, the structure, the form. And we were hoping that by applying this question, they would understand those things effectively. We also wanted students to be able to identify the audience, who is this for, the purpose behind something's creation, why was it created, what intended and unintended value message does this text contain. And afterwards, we actually realized that we will have to amend that question a little bit, because I think the students eventually became, at first, were a little confused between intended value messages and explicit value messages. And so we'll have to fine-tune that one a little bit. The question that I was most excited about, and I think this ties directly to the concept of the remix, is have I applied the criteria above to my own work? Our basic approach was, our thought was, that if we could get students to study texts that meant something to them, if they could deconstruct how the thing works, identify its audience, why it was created, and the value messages it contains, the likelihood of them being able to make their own thing, essentially do a remix or copy and that sort of thing, would increase dramatically. So this was kind of our starting point. But as you can see in the next few slides, at this point we were still, what's the word I want to look at? Worried, I think, a little uncomfortable, unsure of how much freedom we should give. If you take a look at what you're seeing here, there's nothing particularly new and surprising here. This is asking students to produce a media piece of graphic text, write in a variety of forms. Obviously, we're taking that right from the curriculum, and as well, we should. But there's nothing particularly new in what's happening here. These slides, including this slide about the need for conferencing and accountability, I think are the sort of things teachers have always done in some form, right? That there'll be conferencing between peers, conferencing with the teacher to ensure that the student is on the right track. We have a system for accountability, and this is where you can, I think, really see our initial worries about how this freedom would play out, because we were trying to figure out exactly how we're going to track all this stuff. So when we give students this freedom, how do we make sure that they're moving in a direction that's good for them? The last 2 points are specific to our board. So our board's policy when it comes to English exams is that course culminating task will focus on media oral communication, and the exam will focus on the major works of fiction exam, and then the writing styles that the students learn throughout the year. So this is our starting point. And again, we're really excited, but again, a little worried as to how this thing would play out. And I think part of the problem was that we were still relying on those traditional modes of thinking of English class, and we had learned that approach to English, and it had been the way we've been teaching for a long time. I think if you ask most people who studied or experienced high school in Ontario, regardless of age, to name two things they remember from high school English, and my guess is they're going to say Shakespeare in a novel. And there's nothing inherently wrong with those things, but at the same time, we had that approach that kind of locked us into a way of thinking that was proving difficult to break. The other issue we were facing is, and I'm sure this is something we've all faced, making sure that when we teach 3U, 4U, that we send off our students prepared for post-secondary. And yeah, exactly, the text as units approach, Joel, that's exactly the problem. And so we really grappled with this issue. How do we ensure that our students are prepared for whatever they're going to meet the next year without feeling like we are simply mimicking those approaches used at university, whether they are effective or not? And this is where I lied on one of my favorite critics, a gentleman named Neil Postman, wrote a great book called End of Education. I don't know how many times I've read that thing, but his basic argument is that, or was, that post-secondary can't be the be-all and end-all of education, that we can't simply rely on getting students ready for the next level, whatever that next level is. And I'm sure you've heard that same sort of arguments. You know, I've heard elementary teachers say that they need to prepare students for high school, and I've heard high school teachers, and I know I've said it, that we need to prepare students for university. And that's all important, but that can't be our only motivation. So we returned to the curriculum. We took a look at some of the expectations that deal with text. And again, nothing new to us here. We had looked at this before. We notice increasingly complex texts. We know that they're supposed to have a variety of student, teacher-selected texts. But it was this next element that really, I think, helped us change our approach. At the bottom of page 4 of the curriculum document, there is a little footnote, and it says this: the word text is used in this document in its broadest sense. It's a means of communication that uses words, graphics, sounds, and/or images to convey information and ideas to an audience. And this really set our minds on fire. When Melissa and I were thinking about what this means potentially for our students, what sort of approaches we could use, suddenly this kind of opened the floodgates. We didn't feel like we were necessarily limited by our preconceived notions of what we were supposed to do anymore. And so when we started this process of getting students to work around these 5 questions that would dictate almost everything they did throughout the year, we realized some other benefits too. We realized that students would keep coming back to these same questions. So it didn't matter if the question was the form of a text, or if the question was about who is this for, or the value messages. Because they were returning, they would be returning to these questions again and again and again, we would be reinforcing their understanding. So our hope became something like this: if we start with the premise that students can study a wide variety of texts, then what we can do is we can actually inform their understanding of, say, the audience or conventions or form by having them study wildly different texts. And with that in mind, it doesn't really matter which text they're looking at. They can study, one student can be studying a radically different text from another and still have an understanding of that text in the context of that question that informs their whole process throughout the year. So we started reasonably conventionally. We started with those conventions and those forms, what makes things tick. So what I'd like you to do now is I want you to think of a narrative form or medium you particularly enjoy. I will tell you off this right now, I'm going to work with video games for this one. But I would just like you, either in the chat or via the microphone or by the text tool that allows you to write on our nice white slide, just name one convention often featured in a narrative form or medium you enjoy. So for me, I think I'm going to add video games, and I think I'm going to add, my convention will be this one. One of the most common things we tend to see in video games, especially role-playing games or action-adventure, is that the hero at the beginning of the narrative isn't really much of a hero, right? So I do see people, some people have added, TED Talks 18 minutes to communicate. Yeah, love it. So I see you're adding some ideas. If you add movies or something like that, if you can please add something specific that we see in that form that you particularly enjoy. So, Farron, I love the idea of the unreliable narrator in film. I'm curious what you think, Farron. I found that that's a particularly challenging one for students, either in text or traditional text or in film. So okay, video games and immersion. We're seeing some other options here. If anyone would like to share one via the mic, go right ahead. Yeah, quizzes to engage the audience, right? That's often a really common one. Yeah, Farron, I see your point, the connection to critical literacy. Yeah, so exactly. If you're thinking about an unreliable narrator and you start questioning that narrator, you have to be so much more aware of what's going on in the text, and that's a great example. Yeah. So I love that point about the graphic text and the use of the repetitive images, too. Okay. So Mally, at this time, if you wouldn't mind popping that YouTube link into the side, I believe there's, into the chat, I believe there's a YouTube link for about the Monomyth on this slide. Thank you very much. Okay, so if you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to take just a few minutes, I think it's about a 5-minute clip, to take 5 minutes to watch the YouTube link that Mally has provided for us about the Monomyth. And when we come back, we'll discuss that for just a few minutes. And just, again, when you return, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a green check to indicate that you're back in the room. Okay, just waiting for a few more to join us. Excellent. Yeah, I agree. That's a great video, huh? And yeah, archetypes are a great way to frame students' thinking as well. So a few things struck me as we took a look at that video then, and also when we first started using this approach with students, is that the Monomyth, or every retelling of the Monomyth, is essentially a remix, right? It's a variation of this one story that we're seeing over and over again. And Joel, that's a great question. Do students have an experience that transforms them when they read? I hope so. And I'm increasingly looking at English class as a way that, or looking at it as an attempt to help them reach that transformative experience. It doesn't always work, but I hope to show you that in a few minutes, how we hopefully got a little closer to that. What we started with was having them identify conventions in a short story of their choice. So again, this is not anything new. We're certainly not the first teachers to ever have students look at conventions in a text. But we noticed something almost in the next few in the tasks that followed that kind of informed our thinking a little bit. And to show you that, if you could just name a text that is, in your mind, a retelling of that monomyth, hopefully I'll be able to express this for you. Awesome. So you teach a monomyth in grade 9. That's excellent. For me, I'm going to add, let's see, I will add, okay, so we have Lion King, Jungle Book, Hunger Games, Legend of Zelda. It's mine, of course. Yeah, Wizard of the Coast is a great one. And so we're seeing a range here in different kinds of text, right? The Matrix as well. But what I think what we're seeing in this range of text is that they're all in some version or one version of that same kind of story. And it doesn't, in order to understand the monomyth, it's not like you have to look at exactly the same text. So you can look at Kristen's selection of A Wrinkle in Time, The Lion King, Star Wars. All of these are applicable. So the question became for us, well, if a student can learn the monomyth from studying a wide variety of texts, why do we have to necessarily choose the text for them? And so increasingly we came to this realization that if we could encourage students to explore these things in a constructive way and help them at the initial stages of doing their investigations, then they could reach an understanding of this thing or better answer that question, that guiding question, through their own examination of that text. And in the same way that not everyone is going to enjoy Star Wars or Legend of Zelda or even The Breakfast Club, giving them that freedom, or Spider-Man, giving them that freedom to explore a text that means something to them led to much greater engagement as we proceeded. So I'm going to move on to the next slide and discuss some of the other questions that we tried to deal with. We wanted to take a look at value messages. And we wanted to ensure that students had an opportunity to delve deeply into the differences between intended and unintended value messages. Like most of our approaches to these questions, we started with a collective sort of approach where we examined the exact same sort of texts. So we used kind of an I do, we do, you do approach where I would deconstruct and add and look for those value messages that it contained. And then we looked at some examples collectively, and here are two of those examples that we looked at. And students would work collaboratively to make sense of these ads. But because we were building these skills collectively, we're now building the confidence to give students a lot more freedom. This is an excerpt from my blog. And it was, I think, the first time we gave them an incredible amount of freedom. And so the idea here is we've already taken a look at intended and unintended value messages. And what we wanted to do is give them the opportunity to look for value messages in any kind of text they could. So as you can see in the description, it could be something from a sports broadcast. It could be essentially from anything. Now, I will tell you that we did spend a considerable amount of time brainstorming for ideas. So anytime we gave students this kind of freedom, we spent a good 10-15 minutes brainstorming possible connections so students had some starting points. We also gave them some freedom in terms of how they actually wanted to demonstrate their understanding. So cluster diagrams, something digital, as long as they made their thinking visible. And as soon as we started giving them that sort of freedom, some interesting things started to happen. So we started, for example, giving them options about what kind of text they were going to look at in the context of these questions. So here you can see that I gave the option of looking at the depiction of a specific group, outdated stereotype, the depiction of, say, female characters in action movies, We also gave them the option of looking at texts that were deliberately constructed to change people's opinions. So All in the Family, an incredibly famous sitcom from the 1970s. This sitcom was actually designed to satirize its main character, Archie Bunker, despite the fact that he became almost like a folk hero in some way in the United States. The entire show's purpose was to make fun of him and to show the American public how misguided he is or was. We also talked about briefly a game called Gone Home, which explores the inner dynamics of a family that is essentially falling apart for a number of different reasons. This wide sort of range was essentially our starting point. And so we gave students a lot of different options. So I'm seeing some questions on the side. Did I give them some starting points for secondary text too? Yes. So Michelle and Rachel, and we're looking at, actually those questions I think are a little similar. My role during this time period, would essentially be going from student to student and facilitating any way I could. So if I found a student who had decided what kind of text they were going to look at, but they needed, say, a secondary text that would help them understand that thing, I would try and point them in the right direction. So for example, I have a text that is essentially an encyclopedia of mass media and communications that provides overviews of things like conventions and how reality TV shows work and that sort of thing. And so I would spend most of my time directing individual students to ensure that they found secondary sources that were useful and that were moving them along. Yeah, you know, Rachel, it is a great resource. I will, if I can remember what the title is, I will make sure to share that with you. Now that being said, I think it's certainly possible to find all sorts of reasonable commentary online that students can use. And I think part of this process was helping students understand how to differentiate between a source that merely talks about something and a text that actually examines an issue meaningfully. So at this point, Mally, if you wouldn't mind, I've got another YouTube video I would like you to post in there. I'm not sure if the audience is familiar with a YouTube channel called the PBS Idea Channel. It is absolutely spectacular. What this channel does is the host examines, he always starts with a media-based question, an inquiry question, something that students can identify with almost immediately. And he starts by examining this question in a really interesting, humorous sort of way, but he's actually pulling from incredibly robust and meaningful research to back up his assertions. And he often relies on philosophers like Baudrillard to support his analysis. So this video is a great clip about how Miss Marvel, a superhero character, may be changing media for the better. Now this one's a little bit longer. It's about 7.5 minutes or so, but it is action-packed and it is really, really fast-paced. So I think you'll enjoy it. If you wouldn't mind taking a look at that right now, when you come back, just give us the green sign to indicate you're back with us. Okay, so I think we're seeing many of the hands back. That's great. And so I think before we looked at that video, Rachel and Michelle were both asking about examples and pointing them in the direction of secondary texts. I think the video we watched is actually a great example of the kind of secondary text we might rely on. So on the one hand, the host starts by articulating a question he is going to investigate. He provides specific examples from the text, and then near the end, he always connects his thinking to the work of someone who's established in that field. And by looking at examples like this, what we found is students were now, I think, looking at those secondary texts differently. It didn't take too long before before they knew where to go. So in that sense, maybe the first few rounds of this, I would provide a lot more one-on-one direction, try to steer them towards the kinds of text we're looking for that would help them make the most of identifying different kinds of value messages. But I found they needed me less and less, which another way of saying that, I guess, is it's a gradual release of responsibility, right? As we spiraled through this process of becoming more and more comfortable with identifying value messages in text, they relied on me less in order to go through that process. I will say, I think the most challenging question for many students was actually voice, identifying voice. And it actually, we found that we actually had to add another question to deal with it. And I'll get to that question in a few moments. We started in a very similar sort of way that we started with conventions and form. We looked at a couple texts that I provided. This is actually this was a 20-minute exercise we did with a few pages from Lemony Snicket. And I chose this just because I wanted a quick, easy text that would allow them to identify the voice quickly, simply because the author inserts himself so much into that text. So we used a tool here called the Edge browser. So if you have a PC, you probably noticed that there are two different variations of the Explorer browser now. One is called Edge, and what's super cool about Edge is on any website you are on, you can simply, in the top right-hand corner, hit one button. It brings up a bunch of tools that allow you to kind of write on that web page. So you can highlight stuff directly on that page, and you can add comments like these students have here on the side to kind of mark up that text. And so we started by just having the students mark up the text and take a look at some different examples to identify voice and tone. We then moved on to taking a look at some essays that we believed were had very strong voices. Again, though, we did have to add that sixth question at this point because students are having a hard time framing their understanding. We thought that the question about why was this text made, why does it exist, would be enough to help them understand voice, and it wasn't. It was insufficient. So adding this next question of how does voice understand my text really did help. So at this point, Malik, if you can place the links to these articles in the chat, what I thought we could do now is choose any of these essays, or any essay you wish for that matter, scan it really, really quickly, and then on the next slide, what I'd like to talk about briefly is how you would describe the voice in that particular text. Oh, perfect. Thanks, Mally. So, Attitude by Margaret Atwood, Where Do You Get Your Ideas? Neil Gaiman, that is spectacular. I love Neil Gaiman. You Can Do It, Baby, the most amazing bowling story ever. I never thought I'd read an essay about bowling that left me mesmerized. This one did it. It is great. How Headphones Changed the World. That's a little bit more analytical in style. And then excerpts from Friday Night Lights. So if you wouldn't mind, choose one of those. Spend just maybe 2 or 3 minutes taking a look at that essay. And then if you wouldn't mind, on this slide, either through the chat or the slide itself or through the microphone, give us a few words that you would use to describe the author's voice. I like that description of the history of headphones. It's excellent. Yeah, that's what struck me with the most amazing bowling story ever. It does feel a little bit like sports commentary, but really great sports commentary in a way. It kept me hooked because of that feeling. I love that description of the hushed tones awaiting the play. I think that's exactly it. Yeah, I'm just going to move mine so it's not. There we go. Put that there. We'll wait for a few more to return. Yeah, that great quotation from the history of headphones. What a great way to start. Familiarity, I agree completely. It's ironic because I know I'm wearing headphones. I'm going to assume some of you are wearing headphones or you're very close to your headphones. And whoever wrote the Neil Gaiman description, mildly sarcastic, yeah. I love the tone of that article, of that essay, changes so much. It is playful and sarcastic at the beginning, but it becomes incredibly earnest and direct. Sentences are so short. It's quite striking as a story, as the essay continues. So if you wouldn't mind, just so I can see how many people are back, if you haven't, if you can just quickly give us a green check so we can see where everyone is. Okay. So, as I mentioned before, as we're taking a look at these essays, students were struggling at first to identify voice and tone and describe the author's voice in some way. And I think it's important to point out, too, that like other things I've shown you so far, this isn't a new idea. We are certainly not the first English teachers to ever ask their students to try and identify the tone or the voice of an author. But again, because we were trying to build on this through that spiraling method throughout the semester, some interesting things did start to happen. Our goal for the next task was that the students would deconstruct an essay they enjoyed to the fullest extent, taking a look at first lines, organizing principles, all that stuff, and use it to attempt to write their own essays. And what was really interesting about this experience was, if you're going to write the kind of essay that we were just looking at, you've kind of got to put that academic essay off to the side. tried to explain to them that I wanted them to be essayists, not simply write an academic essay. So for some of them, it was a real struggle to put what we had taught them up until this point aside. And in some ways, it was our fault. We had forced upon them one very structured way of writing an essay, and they had kind of locked this into their brains. That's the only way you could possibly do that. And so we had to try and almost deprogram them a little bit and say, listen, certainly we want you to keep that skill, and we're going to develop that skill later on, but we want to use a different approach when you write these particular essays. And so what I loved most about this was seeing how student voices were really starting to come out. I think by examining essays that had unique voices, the students, I think, were a little bit more adept at finding their own. This is one of my personal favorites. Anyone want to take a wild guess what the rest of the essay is about based on this? I should point out, too, that I left one important word out of this. It should be the first time I walked through a brick wall. It changed my life. Anyone take a wild guess? Pink Floyd, good guess. It's not it, though. Harry Potter, there you go. Well done, April. Yeah, so this student was obsessed with everything to do with Harry Potter. Again, not surprising. Many, I will admit, to be slightly obsessed with that series as well. But her essay was just one of many where, because we were focusing on their own experience first, and that they had learned to how to write one of these pieces by examining an expert's first, and an expert that they chose, the quality of those essays was much stronger than what we had seen before. And in particular, the first lines were great, as I mentioned, but the voices were really, really just starting to shine through. And this is where that focus on that question about making your own thing, developing your own work, really, really started to become, in my estimation, our most important question. So as we get to this next part, I want you to think about this. I want you to think back to the last time you heard students enter the room talking about a text. And remember, we're using the text in the broadest definition. So I want you to think back to any time you've heard a group of students coming in and talking about that thing they watched, that game they played, that story they just read. Add it to either the whiteboard or the chat, or you can take over the microphone. I'll give you a moment or two to add your thoughts. Yeah, Black Panther. Yeah. Ooh, Legend of Zelda. And Key and Peele. So happy to see Get Out get some recognition this week at the Oscars. If you haven't seen Get Out, that is a masterful piece of social horror, I think is the right term for Fortnite as well. So we're seeing a lot of games, certainly, right? So Call of Duty, Fortnite, which is something that all the students seem to be talking about these days. Yeah, so here's the thing. If we start with the premise that we are going to work with 6 questions throughout the year, and we're going to return to these questions numerous times, the stakes at any particular time aren't quite as high, which means we can be a lot more experimental, I think, in how we encourage students to examine texts. So while we still would have students examine traditional texts, this framework also gave us an opportunity for students to examine some of the things we have on the screen. And I'm going to try and show you in a moment or two how we actually got to that point. This is one of those moments where we really started to, where this project really started to take off. We had just done some work with value messages, and the students actually completed an assignment where they were attempting to identify value messages in some ads. And we spent initially about 2 or 3 days with this essential task, where I almost gave them carte blanche and just said, well, listen, what do you want to do next? We can make the connections to their curriculum as soon as we establish what you want to do. and we gave them an incredible amount of choice. So some students really enjoyed looking at value messages, so I gave them the option of turning this into something a little bit bigger. So I stole an idea that I think one of my colleagues working on media studies came up with, where we had students take an existing ad campaign, a problematic ad campaign, and repitch it so that it is more in keeping with the students' values. Students could write a short story. They'd have to identify conventions of a genre. And so you see, again, a pattern where students can make different choices, but they have to find out the rules of that thing first. So if they want to write a short story, great. How does, if you want to write a horror short story, wonderful. How does a horror short story work? What are its nuts and bolts? They also had the option of analyzing text in a lot more detail. They could investigate voice, including the voice of their favorite recording artist. What I want to show you next is the wide range of stuff the students actually did. And this was an amazing day or two. So we had a small group of students who were obsessed with political coverage in the United States, and they spent 2 days investigating bias in the coverage of Trump. Some students were looking at in-depth examinations of different value messages and ads. You can read some of the options here that students completed. One student is a voracious reader. Interestingly, she's also the student who came up with that opening line from Harry Potter. So she wanted to dedicate her time to studying novels. So she actually studied more novels than anyone in the class because she made that choice. We had students who actually created a podcast where they examined forms and conventions in music. And I should have corrected that, not so much in the conventions and form of the musicianship itself, but more so conventions in the lyrics or in music videos. So it's more about examining a media piece. We had some students examining short stories, value messages in film, and the last one at the very bottom was one I found particularly interesting. Turns out I had a student who had been, since grade 9, working on a short series of short stories that he wanted to turn into, I guess the best way of thinking about this would be an animated manga series. So he'd been writing this narrative, and his goal was to actually create an animated version of his stories. So he approached me one day and he said, Mr. Pedrek, I've been working on this and I'm animating myself. Do you think for a media task I could actually create the animated scene from a story that I'm trying to create on my own? And after looking at the curriculum, it didn't take me long to figure out that this easily fits in the context of the sort of stuff we need to do for the curriculum, but also in the context of our questions. And he spent hours every night at home working on this thing to get to the point where he felt comfortable submitting that. And so because the students over this time period were engaged in texts that not only engaged them but also met our expectations, it was just a pleasure to watch. And it also led to some incredible conversations. I'm going to try to touch on those a little bit as we move forward. The conversations the students had based on these on their work was just wonderful. So one of the biggest problems we had was trying to figure out how we're going to keep track of all this stuff. And so I actually created a series of badges in D2L, and I'll be more than happy to share these badges with you once I figure out how to actually do that. I'm guessing a mass email might work. But what we did is we created a series of badges. You notice they're color-coded. So all the badges that are red have something to do with audience. And all the badges that are blue, form, voice, that sort of thing, are green. And this helped us tremendously. And I'm going to show you a couple of these badges up close. So, for example, if a student chose to examine voice in an essay, and since most students already done that as a group, as a class task, I could just issue them this badge. If a student decided to examine purpose of an audio text and to try and ascertain why that text was created and what purpose it serves, they receive this badge. Now, it's important to note this in no way replaces assessment and evaluation. This is merely a tracking system that we use. So where this is really advantageous is I could issue a series of badges to, say, April, and I could note that, let's say, as April and I sit down to look at the badges she has received, we note that she has a number of different badges involving audience and form and voice, but we notice that maybe she hasn't taken a look at a particular kind of text. So maybe she's looked at essays, she has looked at poetry, but she maybe hasn't looked at new media or film. So instead of saying to April, hey, here's what you must do next, April and I could simply say, well, look, it looks like there's a gap here where you haven't done anything with any new media yet. Your next task should probably involve new media. And so even though I was posing some limitations to ensure that the students were meeting curricular expectations, there was still an incredible amount of choice in terms of what they could actually do, right? And so those conversations often became just really, really constructive, because it was more about trying to figure out what would work for that student and help them demonstrate the learning necessary. Now, I will admit there are a few badges in retrospect I wish I had added. Here are two more that we did have. The two I wish I had added, I'm going to be adding this year, is text from different eras, just to ensure that students are looking at texts from a variety of time periods. Now, we do certainly meet that requirement when we take a look at Shakespeare, but at the same time, I want to encourage students to be aware of how the time period of a text may impact that text. And the other one, too, I think, certainly adding a badge that indicates that students have studied texts from different cultures would be an excellent way of ensuring that students are really getting that wide variety of exposures to different kinds of texts that the curriculum wants us to provide them. So, where did this all lead us? Well, it really seemed like the students were driving their own learning. They had, yeah, and Joel, that's a great point. A badge indicating increasingly complexity would be an excellent addition. And I think, too, one I was toying with earlier today is perhaps identifying different groups within Canadian culture as well, so that we ensure that not only we're getting voices from different communities globally, but also that they're considering different voices in our own country as well. But I love the idea of a badge about increasing exactly diversity. So a badge for diversity, a badge for complexity. And what I love about those ideas, Joel, is that the text they choose to examine could be wildly different and could be from different mediums, but they're still getting that higher order thinking and meeting those curricular expectations, but examining wildly different texts. And so I think once we give students these choices, what we saw was the course seemed to be so much more about them than our last incarnation of ENG3U, which, as if you recall at the beginning, I said the students a few years ago found very prescribed and uninspiring. And one of the things I loved the most about this whole experience was the kinds of conversations we were having. The thing that's going to stick with me for a while is that those last, that group of gentlemen I mentioned that were taking a look at bias in the media. They spent somewhere in the range of 50 minutes, one period, having an in-depth conversation about bias in media, taking a look at great sources like the New York Times and other reputable newspapers, discussing the impact of bias on perception. And even when the conversations weren't quite that good, they were still really good, I think, because everyone was bringing themselves to that conversation. So everyone was bringing their own perspective on a text that no one else may have looked at. And that just made the whole experience so much more engaging, because that diversity, to steal Joel's word, that diversity that we're seeing around that group of 4 students really provided lots of opportunity to discuss their findings in interesting ways. And again, if you think of that as another way of spiraling, if we have 4 students who are all looking at, say, conventions in given texts, but all looking at wildly different texts in different genres, when they listen to each other, they now have a better understanding of how conventions and form impact any piece of text. what was particularly interesting for me is how much this clarified the why of what we're doing, the purpose behind all of this. And I think that became really, really evident when we got to the culminating activity. I wasn't sure what our culminating activity would look like, but I settled on this about halfway through the year. And to me, it just makes so much sense. I'm increasingly drawn to culminating activities that have a metacognitive element. And I should say to Rachel Kongsaw, if you happen to be in this, I completely stole this idea from you, so thanks. So basically, what students would do for this culminating activity, and again in our board, culminating activities for English have to be oral tasks. They would choose any of the 3 questions that we worked with all year, and they would explain how their understanding of that question grew throughout the year. And as they articulated their growth, they were responsible for referring to the text that helped them get there. So that's at least one of the questions, as you see in one of the points, had to refer to the novel or the play we had that they did examine. But any of the text they studied along the way, even ones they may have done for 1 or 2 days, they could use those texts to help them explain how their understanding of those questions had grown throughout the semester. And again, this culminating activity no longer felt like just a hoop they were jumping through. This felt like a real conversation. And that metacognitive element where they were reflecting back on their thinking, I think, was key to that. And I thoroughly enjoyed listening to them, listening to their work. The last thing, official thing I'll leave you with is this. We kept Shakespeare, and we did do a novel study. So this is, if we go back to the idea of a remix, it's not like we every single element was completely gone. But I will say this: it seemed to me that the engagement with Shakespeare and with the novels was different, and I can't help but wonder if it's because we had spent so much time building skills on those 6 questions and encouraging students to talk and discuss meaningfully about those 6 questions, that these things just led to a much more in-depth conversation about Shakespeare and about the text they were looking at. So all in all, it just felt like an experience where even when we were studying those teacher-selected texts, it was still much more driven by student experience. So all in all, it was a wonderful year. Now my next step is trying to figure out how I'm going to replicate this with as many courses as I possibly can. I thank you for listening to me ramble on about this project. If you want to take over the mic and ask any questions that way or make any comments, if you want to make comments on a screen, I'll try and switch back to a screen that's perhaps white. Yeah, there we go. This might help. Let's see. I'll find one that has a white background, so it's a little easier for us to add ideas if you wish. Let's go back to this one. If you can add questions via the audio or in the chat, or if you have any statements you would like to make on the screen, I'll leave it up to you. Oh, thanks, Sarah. Glad you liked it. Again, if you go back to my blog, you could, especially if you search for ENG3U, you'll find a lot of the blog entries where we kind of built this process. You'll see it kind of grow over time. And I got to admit, too, it's actually changed the way I'm approaching 4C right now. I'm just giving them a lot more freedom. If anyone knows Danica Barker, and she's the Thames Valley District School Board, she is awesome. And so what we've been doing is she had this great project on the online course where she had students in 4C study a genre instead of a particular novel. Yeah, okay, great, John, and this is what I get to right now. And so what I've been doing now with 4C is taking that basic approach, but I'm saying, okay, here are a whole bunch of genres, including fiction and nonfiction. You can study any genre you want, but your goal is to become an expert in that genre. So if you decide on sci-fi, you decide on fantasy, you want to do something with autobiographies, all good. But you've got to find out how that text works, how that genre works, and then you are responsible for reading a wide variety of texts. So options include, yeah, you can look at a novel and you can read a novel, but you can also choose to read 4 to 5 other texts instead. So any collection of short stories, essays, full-length essays, and graphic novels that total 5, you could do that too, as long as they're all from that same genre. And so, John, what I'm seeing so far is the engagement is so much higher because the students get to choose texts and genres that they're interested in. But as long as we get them to work within the context of understanding how this applies to the genre, and then spiraling that, right, coming back to that genre again and again, we can hit so many curricular expectations that way. So again, are they responsible for finding the text? That's where I help them. I think that comes back to students don't know what they don't know, right? So that's where being an avid reader helps, right? So I try to find out what they're interested in. I try to give them some guidance, different kinds of texts that they might want to look at. And then we, for example, we go down to the library, and a librarian will help them as well. But our goal is if we can find a couple texts that engage those 4C students, well, you know this, if students are engaged and empowered and they're into it, everything else is pretty easy, right? And if we can get to the point where we get them engaged and interested in their text, then we can take care of everything else. Studying text at the same time. Oh, we just lost our slide there, so I'm going to go back a little bit. Sorry about that, everybody. I saw a question about our students studying the same text at the same time. Okay. So, Joel, that question, that depends on the kinds of texts we're looking at and the amount of time they take. So, for example, when we do a novel study, and I do give them a number of different choices for novels, that is more time sensitive, obviously, and so we tend to focus on those same texts at the same time. But of those other tasks I mentioned that were, say, the 2 or 3 days or a week-long sort of thing, there's a lot more options for what students could do. So, for example, if one student finished a task before the other one, so they could simply try another one and build from there. So I guess the short answer is longer texts we're working on them. Yeah, so Shakespeare all at the same time. So I remember, Joel, you made that comment about the badge for increasingly complex texts. To me, the reason why we're studying Shakespeare is because it is that complex text, right? And so out of fairness to the students, that's something we need to do together. Right? I think that's, in my opinion, something where we have to build our understanding together, as opposed to letting them off on their own. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. So thanks, Jim. I'm going to actually invite people to, if they have additional questions, to email them to you. And is that okay? Just because looking at the time and just sort of understanding that it's been a long day for you and also for everyone else. So just a couple of things to finish up for OTF. One of them is, let me just